Aye, for peril Scotland's sake, some use of plan or book could make, or sing a sang at least. In the summer of 1756 at the country fair, William Burns met Agnes Brown at this location. They fell in love, and this gave him reason to build a cottage at Alloway. The following year they married.
Was born in Kyle, but what na day, oh what na style, a duty, a play worthwhile to be the night with Robin. For Robin was a roving boy, a rantin', roving, roving. Robin was a roving boy, oh rantin', roving, Robin. Our monarch's hindmost year Badane was 25 days begun. 'Twas then a blast o' January wind blew and stole in on Robin. For Robin was a roving boy, a rantin'.
After 13 months of wedlock, on January 25th, Agnes was delivered of a son, and we called him Robert. Robert was but a day old when christened by the Reverend William Dalrymple, whose remains lie buried here in the old Kirkenair. Here a genius was born, destined to give the world an imperishable legacy of poetry and song. He was born of a humble, devout and admirable man, and of an industrious mother. These qualities he inherited stood him in good stead throughout his life. Also born at Alloway were Gilbert, Agnes and Annabella. William Burns cultivated 7 acres of land at the cottage, but found it reluctant. He implemented the family income by other manual works such as road making. However, poverty was never far from their door, yet a happy, close-knit family it was. William Burns, full of virtue and piety, worshipped with his family in the old Kirkenair and made sure that they had a strict religious education. The Cotter of the Saturday Night is an exact copy of William Burns in his manner, his devotions, and his exhortations. Raby considered that there was something particularly venerable in the phrase, "Let us worship God," when his father led them in family devotions. Little is known of Raby's life as a child, but with the beautiful River Doon nearby, where he possibly spent many happy hours, and with his observant eyes and sponge-like mind, he first saw the beauty of the field and the flower, of the trees he loved, and of the running water. His heart must have responded to every living thing. Here, the seeds of his philosophy of life and the understanding of nature were implanted, and which came forth in his poetry and song, which he composed in later life. Education was almost an obsession with William Burns, especially for his family, that he sent them to Alloway Mill School. Soon after, the teacher left, but Burns with 4 others engaged John Murdoch to teach their children. When Raby was 10 days old, a violent storm rendered the cottage uninhabitable. The family were afforded shelter and succour in Alloway Mill while repairs were being made. Here too, William Burns lodged whilst building the cottage. field is the site of the school at Alloway Mill. In 1766, the family moved to Mount Oliphant Farm, 2 miles east of Alloway, with hope in their hearts, but it proved disastrous. The soil was stony and barren, food was scarce, plenty of work but little return. William counselled his family in education himself by candlelight, yet Gilbert and Robert were sent to Dalrymple School to improve their penmanship, still at the farm.
Life was like the cheerless gloom of a hermit with the unceasing moil of a galley slave.
Here too were born William, John and Isabella. In 1773, Raby studies grammar and French with John Murdoch in Ayr for 3 weeks, and he wrote his first poem, Handsome Nell. The plaque shows the position of Murdoch School in the Sandgate in Ayr.
Signed to the Legland Wood when it was late, to make us silent and a safe retreat.
While at school in Dalrymple, the village blacksmith loaned Raby a book on the history of Wallace, which so impressed him that
It poured the Scottish prejudice into my veins, which will boil along there till the floodgates of life shut in eternal rest.
after a day's work he would walk the half-dozen miles to the Legland Woods with devout enthusiasm, and explore every den and dell where he thought Wallace would have lodged. Perhaps this experience sowed the seeds of his famous song,
Scots were here in Wallace led, Scots from Bruce and Afton led, welcome to your glory bed, or to victory. Now the
In 1774, Raby was sent to Hugh Rogers School in Kirkoswell for mensuration, dialing and survey. But with so much smuggling and drinking there, he made greater progress in the knowledge of mankind. In 1774, after a bitter quarrel with Factor of Mount Oliphant, the Burns family happily left. William Burns rented the 130-acre farm of Lochlee, which again proved to be barren through waterlogging. Raby was 18, had a better education than most, and he tasted the bustling life of Bolton for which he craved. And here he started to rhyme in fun and found plenty of targets for it.
The present-day occupier told us the soil was just as barren today as it was in Raby's time. He is a sheep farmer.
Born in 1760, David Siller of Spittleside Farm became a firm friend of Raby's. They both had so much in common, as Burns describes him in his epistle to Davy, a brother poet, lover, ploughman and fiddler. He was a better fiddler than Raby, but as a poet he fell short of what was required to be acceptable at that time. Siller was self-educated, and misfortune followed him in his wake. Failing in many projects, due possibly to devoting too much time to versifying, he published a book, after which he became bankrupt. but came into wealth on the death of his brother. Prosperous at last, he served for many years on the Irvine Town Council, and in 1827 he helped to form the Irvine Burns Club. In the village of Bolton is the building in which the Bachelors' Club was held, and which was still occupied until around 1920. Preserved in its original state, many relics of the Rabbie's time are still to be seen. In this two-storied house, the ground floor shows the typical living conditions which prevailed in the mid-18th century, a kitchen cum bedroom with the adjoining cow byre. Upstairs, in the top flat, is the room in which the Bachelors' Club was founded on 11th November 1780 by Rabbie, Gilbert and 5 others. Rabbie was appointed chairman at its first meeting, and its aim was that of a literary and debating society. It carried on long after Rabbie left the district. Here too, he learned to dance against the wishes of his strict Calvinistic father. Also in this room, he was initiated, passed, and raised in Freemasonry. Stonehouse, the home of Mrs. Catherine Stewart, where Burns chaperoned Siller when David was courting Peggy Orr, a maidservant to Mrs. Stewart. Rabbie left some poems for her staff to read, and they fell into the hands of Mrs. Stewart, who inquired as to the composer. This was the start of a firm friendship and of the Stair manuscript. Rabbie possibly met Mary Campbell here too. Mrs. Stewart built this house on the Enterkin estate and called it Afton Lodge. Here too, Burns presented her with a number of poems, which is now known as the Afton manuscript. Rabbie and Gilbert took over some land from their father and grew flax, a lucrative crop, and with some success, for they won a prize of £3. Armed with this incentive, and knowing that their profit margin could be increased, Rabbie went to Irvine to learn how to heckle it for the spinners. It was an unfortunate mistake, for Rabbie was dogged with ill health. He met Richard Brown, who taught him the art of seduction. This sowed the seeds of Rabbie's future amorous madnesses. Burns returned home penniless and a failure. This thatched building is the flax dressing workshop. Adam Hill, a farm in the parish of Craigie, was occupied by John Rankin. Burns said of Rankin, rough, rude, ready-witted Rankin, the whalecocks for fun and drinking. Rankin's daughter Annie was the subject of the song Corn Rigs. This grating is of Burns's time. And this oak tree could tell an amorous tale about Rabbie. Worn out beyond his years with hardship, worrying about litigation on arrears of rent, the lack of proper nourishment, and unfit for labour, yet he lived and worked unceasingly for his family. He was buried according to his wishes in the old kirk at Alloway, not realising his immortality, amid the beauty of the River Doon, and a nearby monument erected in honour to his son, who is now world famous. What better resting place could any man wish for?
O death, the poor man's dearest friend, the kindest and the best, welcome the hour my aged limbs are laid with thee at rest. The great, the wealthy fear thy blow, from pomp and pleasures torn, but oh, a blessed relief to those that weary-laden mourn.
Within a mile of Mauchline is Mossgiel Farm, leased by Gavin Hamilton to Rabbie and Gilbert in 1784. They found the soil to be much better. Gilbert, really, was the manager of the farm because Rabbie had too many distractions. Here, his most prolific years of writing came to be, with many famous poems being composed. Here, too, his social life and his amorous madnesses became more pronounced. Life at last had become much better for the Burns family. Near the farm are two fields, the first in which Burns destroyed the nest of field mouse while ploughing. He apologised in rhyme to a mouse with masterly philosophy in the last two verses. In the second field, whilst ploughing, he crashed among the stour, uprooting the daisy. He wrote to a daisy which has a pastoral image that has yet to be matched. This stone, erected at the spot where Death and Dr. Hornbook was inspired, a satire on John Wilson. In the Cowgate Mauchline is the Armour House. James Armour, a mason and contractor, strictly Calvinistic, rejected Burns mainly for his radical leanings in church doctrines. His daughter Jean met Rabbie at a dance, and subsequently came the romance and the feud between her father and Rabbie. Here is the window at which Jean sat and passed amorous conversations to Rabbie, who sat at the window in Johnny Dove's alehouse, directly opposite.
Adjoining Gavin Hamilton's house is the Castle of Mauchline, which he bought, but later sold it to, then leased it back from the Earl of Loudon. Gavin Hamilton, a lawyer and close friend of Burns, was described by Raby as the poor man's friend in need, the gentleman in word and deed. He lies buried here in Mauchline, radical like Burns, as opposed to the all-lax like Daddy Old and Holy Willie, also at rest in Mauchline.
I will I deserve such just damnation through broken laws.
Buried here in Ayr All Kirkyard is Robert Aiken, to whom Burns dedicated the Scottish Saturday Night. Cowgate Mauchline is the world-famous Pussy Nancy's Inn, frequented in Burns's time by beggars and gangrel bodies. Pussy Nancy was the wife of George Gibson, who had a son Jock and a half-witted daughter called Racer Jess. Burns visited this inn and was inspired to write The Jolly Beggars. The house is still preserved. They lie buried here in the Old Kirk in Mauchline. Godly Bryan, a pious man who is mentioned in the Court of Equity. Children on school projects and lovers of Burns pay homage in Mauchline churchyard. Clockmaker mentioned in the Court of Equity. The Blethering Bitch was a stonemason, so called for his interruptions in conversation, especially in church doctrines. Robert Wilson, a weaver, reputed to be the sweetheart of Jean Armour. The Herds boy and general outdoor servant at Moss Guild for 4 years. Referred to in a poem to Gavin Hamilton recommending a boy, he was a knavish cattle dealer.
Sweet Upton among thy green braes, flow gently, I'll sing thee a song in thy praise. My whose echo resounds through the glen, ye wild whistling blackbirds in yon thorny den. Thou green-crested lapwing, thy screaming forbear, I charge you this.
Glenafton, near New Cumnock, and especially Afton Water, which Burns so vividly describes in his poem, inspires the visitor as it did with the poet, with its placidity, its verdancy, and its meanderings. The unruffled atmosphere, disturbed only by the murmur of the stream and the warblings of the feathered denizens, creates a feeling of peace and contentment,
which the visitor can only but savour.
Besides, how wanton thy waters her snowy feet lave, as gathering sweet flowerets she stems thy clear wave. Flow gently.
Here, George explains the Afton manuscript, which Burns presented to Mrs. Alexander Stewart of Stair in 1791.
The theme of my lays, my Mary's asleep by thy murmuring stream. Flow gently, sweet Afton, disturb not our
Beside the Fale stream as it joins the River Aire, Faleford is a beautiful little hamlet, unchanged by the passing years. Here in 1844, at the age of 86, James Humphrey, the blethering bitch, died. He spent his last years in an almshouse in Faleford. The early life of Mary Campbell is sketchy, but however, she came to Ayrshire and was eventually employed at Coylesfield, or as Burns called it, the Castle of Montgomery. After the trouble with Jean Armour, by this time dispatched to Paisley, Highland Mary caught Burns in the rebound.
My Highland lass was a warm-hearted, charming young creature, as ever blessed a man with generous love.
It was in 1785 she became acquainted with and learned to love the poet, and at the time of bitterness with Armours she helped to resurrect him. But the romance was short-lived. Near the spot, he spent the day in farewell with her on 14th of May, 1786. Later that year she died in Greenock.
That sacred hour can I forget? Can I forget that hallowed grove, where by the winding Aire we met, to live one day of parting love?
The grounds of Mauchline Church, on which was held the Holy Fair. As we enter Ayr today, we cross the new brig, as opposed to the old brig, closed except for pedestrian traffic. The cross-dock and jalousies of the two brigs is masterly in rhyme and composition.
Will your poor narrow footpath of a street, where 12 wheelbarrows tremble when they meet, your ruined formless hulk of stain and lime, compared with bonny brigs of modern time? Conceited gowk, puffed up with windy pride, this mony a year I've stood the flood and tide, and though with crazy ield I'm sair for fairn, I'll be a brig when you're a shapeless cairn.
And this prophecy came to pass in 1877, when the south end of the new bridge collapsed, having been damaged by floods and tide. written and dedicated to William Ballantyne, a banker and merchant in Ayr, who later became provost. At the age of 27 in 1786, Burns wrote the poem The Lass of Ballochmyle and sent it to Wilhelmina Alexander with a letter in the penultimate of flowery language. Miss Alexander ignored both the poem and the letter. Burns was mortified, perhaps because of Burns's reputation, and perhaps on her brother's advice. Wilhelmina never married, and in her later life she kept both the letter and the song in a glass case. She died in Glasgow in 1843 at the age of 88 years. After publishing the Kilmarnock edition of his poems in 1786, Dr. Blacklock invited Rabbie to Edinburgh. He stayed overnight at Covington Main's farm near Biggar on his 2-day journey to Edinburgh on November the 27th. In the High Street, Edinburgh, where Burns lodged, a little change has taken place, yet he would see spinning wheels. He would see John Knox's house and definitely logical winning Canongate. Lodged with John Richmond, whose remains lie in Mauchline Churchyard, in Baxter Close, next to Lady Stair's house. Richmond was Rabbie's friend and correspondent. He studied law and later returned to Mauchline and established himself as a solicitor. Near St Giles was the offices of William Creech, who published many editions of Burns's work. Eventually, Creech bought the copyright for 100 guineas, but months passed before paying Rabbie. The Canongate Church in the Royal Mile, where the remains of Robert Ferguson, a poet, are resting. He died at the age of 24, and whose works were admired by Rabbie. With the result, Burns erected this headstone. Here at Calton Hill was Clarinda's house. Here too is the resting place of Mrs. McElhose or Clarinda. As long as A Fond Kiss is sung, Clarinda will be remembered. Looking down on these two graves is the Burns Monument. Gilbert Burns left Mossgiel in 1798, farmed at Dinning and Nitsdale for 2 years, then managed Morham Farm in East Lothian for 4 years. In 1804, he began factoring Loch Blantyre's estate and lived here at Grant's Braes near Headington with his wife, his family, his mother, and his sister Annabella. Gilbert, his mother, and Annabella are buried here in Bolton Churchyard, about 2 miles from Grant's Braes. Gilbert lived for 67 years and his mother for 88 years. During our sojourn to Aberfeldy, we decided to take the path Burns took and try to experience the mental impressions Burns would have when inspired to write The Birks of Aberfeldy. Armed with the words of the poem, we walked leisurely towards the Falls of Moness, where Burns said he wrote the poem. He so vividly describes its nature trail, not only as it was yesteryear, but truly as it is today. We saw the summer blinks on Fleury Braes, the crystal streamlets. We saw the lofty waws. We heard the birds singing. We heard and saw all that Burns describes. Yet, if we didn't have the poem, would we have noticed the bounteous nature in all its glory, of which Burns adored as the desert traveller would, in quenching his thirst with water? Here we rest on the seat where, reputedly, Burns wrote the poem. Tarbolton Mill was owned by William Muir, who was a great friend of the Burns family. He took in Jean Armour, who discovered that she was pregnant for the second time by Rabbie, who visited her here on the 23rd of February 1788, whilst riding back to Mossgiel from Dunlop House. Thereafter, he wrote to Clorinda calling Jean
a foreign token beside the cloudless glory of the meridian sun.
The sun being, of course, Clorinda. When Muir died in 1793, and through the good offices of Gavin Hamilton, Burns helped Muir's widow financially. In Castle Street, Mauchline, is Dr. Mackenzie's house, a good friend of Burns, and in February 1788, Rabbie rented a room next door for Jean Armour, who had already borne him twins and was now expecting another child to him. The bed in which the child, but to be more accurate, the twins were born, both of whom died within the month. piece of Wilhelmina Alexander shawl, so delicate now it has to be protected by glass. In May 1788, the window of the room in Gavin Hamilton's house in which Burns married Jean. Child mortality was high in those days, and here in the armour grave in Mauchline lie 4 of Burns's children. Nan Stonehouse was one of Mauchline's hostesses. It was in her alehouse where Burns studied politics over a glass of good old Scotch drink. Originally called the Sorn Inn, it was built in 1712 and stands opposite Dr. Mackenzie's house. Burns had been 6 months in Ellisland and had reaped his first crop. Jean wanted to join him, but the house at Ellisland was still not completed. And here at the Isle Tower in early December 1788, she and her family found lodgings. Ellisland Farm, 6 miles northwest of Dumfries on the banks of the River Nith, was offered to Rabbie by Patrick Miller of Dalswinton in 1787. Burns took it from the 13th of June 1788, but had to build a farmhouse for which Miller gave Rabbie £300. But by the end of 1790, Burns had decided that Ellisland was a ruinous business. In 1788, Rabbie received a course in excise duties, and on September the 1st, Burns began his life as an excise officer. In the granary is the effigy of Burns in the process of sowing seeds, and near at hand the type of plough which he would have used. Along this path beside the River Nith he walked in pensive mood, composing his poems, of which the most famous is Tam O'Shanter. Here he saw the wounded hare, and in sympathy he wrote the poem. Stones on which was built a stack. He rested on it and wrote to Mary in heaven. Looking towards Mauchline he composed, "Frae all the earth the wind may blow," thinking of his bonny Jean. A beautiful estate on the River Nith was owned by Captain Robert Riddle. The house was built on the former site of a small monastic establishment. Riddle gave Rabbie the freedom of the grounds, so that he may wander on the estate in meditation. also built the little house called the Hermitage, which Burns used frequently in meditation. Here too, in the Hermitage, he would edit and correct his poems. In Kirkoswell Old Churchyard are the graves of Rabbie's mother's forebears. Curtin Jean, an innkeeper in Kirkoswell. And John Davison, or Suitor Johnny. Suitor Johnny was a local cobbler and no doubt well known to the Burns family. His house is now a museum. Douglas Graham's grave, who was depicted as Tam O'Shanter.
With favours secret, sweet and precious, the suitor told his queerest stories. The landlord's laugh was ready chorus. To our tale, ye market nicht, Tam had geplanted Unker recht fast by an Ingle bleasin' finely, with reaming swats that drank divinely, and at his elbow Suitor Johnny, his ancient trusted drouthy crony. Tam lued him like a very brother. They had been fools for weeks together. Will mounted on his grey mare Meg, a better never lifted leg. Tam skelped on through Dublin mire, despising wind and rain and fire, whilst holding fast his gid blue bonnet, whilst crooning o'er some old Scots sonnet, whilst glowering round with prudent cares, lest bogles catch him unawares. Kirkalloway was drawing nigh, where ghasts and hoolits nightly cry. And vow, Tam saw an uncas sight, warlocks and witches in a dance, nae cut along Brent new frae France, but hornpipes, jigs, surveys and reels, put life and metal in their heels, and when it bunker in the east, their saddle, neck and shape of beast. Oh, first, ye sleep. First, ye keeper, sign another. Tam tint his reason altogether, and roars to, "We'll done cut his sark," and in an instant all was dark. And scarcely had he Maggie rallied, when out the hellish legion sallied. Ah, Tam, they'll get their fern, and hell they'll roast thee like a hern. Hard upon noble Maggie pressed, and flew at Tam with furious ettle, and little wist she Maggie's mettle. Ye spring brought up her master hill, and left behind her ain grey tail. The carlin, caught her by the rump, and left poor Maggie scarce a stump.
Shanter Farm, near the Maiden's Rocks in Carrick, was leased by Douglas Graham, who owned a boat called Tam o' Shanter. Burns had met him, and during a storm, Burns as a boy stayed overnight at the farm. Graham, who kept his money in his bonnet, had his bonnet blown off with the wind, losing all his money. Burns heard the quarrel between husband and wife, Kate. Thus came the descriptive part in the poem Tam o' Shanter. Graham, it was believed, used the boat for contraband purposes. The hill, called Shauntor, after which the farm is named. On November the 11th, 1791, Burns renounced the lease of Ellisland and moved into a free apartment house in the Wee Vennel, now Bank Street, and the following February he was promoted to the Dumfries Port Division. With a salary of £90 and could afford a maidservant, he was now considered middle class. And although Burns entered fully into the life of the town, poetry and songs still poured from his pen. A tavern in Dumfries, owned by Mr. and Mrs. Hislop in Raby's time. In a letter to George Thompson, he described the Globe Inn as, for these many years, my favourite house. It is still to this day a popular inn. In this room are many relics of Raby's time. Here he would sit in debate and discussion with many of his friends and cronies in his own corner chair, a tradition now that whoever sits in that chair pays for the drinks for all who are in the room. Lines of poetry etched on the glass by Raby. The room and the bed where Raby seduced Anna Park, who was a barmaid and niece of the Hislops. After 18 months, the Burns family moved into a self-contained house in Mill Street, now Burns Street. He became a member of the Dumfries Volunteers and was also a burgess. Life was good, but in failing health. He went to Brow, a village on the Solway, for treatment, part of which was wading into the Solway up to his armpits, the worst possible treatment for his complaint. Maria Riddle paid a farewell visit at Brow and was horrified to see the change in him. the original desk and chair which Rabbi used in his study. Again, lines etched by Rabbi. The bed in which Rabbi died on 21st July 1796. He was nursed by Jessie Lures because Jean was expecting. The child was born the day Rabbi was buried. His body lay in state in this building for 3 days. Rabbi worshipped in St. Michael's Church. The pew in which he sat is clearly marked. Rabbi was given a military funeral, his remains being carried to St. Michael's Church to the Dead March. Dumfries turned out to honour his memory, and the volunteers fired a volley on his grave. 19 years later, Burns was reinterred in the mausoleum built by public subscription. With him in the mausoleum are Jean, his wife, and some members of his immediate family.
The grave of Jessie Lures, who nursed him during his last days, protected from the elements by the mausoleum.
Pilgrims pay homage and lay wreaths in the memory of the ploughman poet, who lived a full life arm in arm with poverty, but left to the world a wonderful, rich legacy.
By night it shines by day, and ne'er grows dim with time. It rolls upon the banks of air, it shone on moon's clear stream. 100 years are gain and more, yet brighter grows it green. Let kings and courtiers rise and fall, this world has money turned, but brightly beams above them all.